We're starting our book study of Paul's letter to the Romans. So last week we went over the context for the book. Paul is writing it to the shattering city of Rome during the reign of Nero. Christians are being persecuted, killed, martyred, and not only that, we got this huge problem of what are called Judaizers, which are people that are trying to, for lack of a better word, Jew up Christianity. So being overzealous, saying you have to do this, you have to do that, blah, blah, blah. And meanwhile, everyone is starting to fall into really abhorrent sin. And it's wrecking this new fledgling church at Rome. So Paul writes a letter to the Romans, and it's like 52 AD. And now here we are 2,000 years later reading this letter. And it's still very topical. So Chapter 1, he's introducing himself, introducing his reasons for not visiting Rome, and kind of starting to outline what the problem is that he's going to be talking about for the rest of the epistle, and that's namely ungodliness and unrighteousness. So people that are losing sight of God, losing sight of not only the law of Moses, but they're losing sight of the natural law that exists within us all, is a big point. And they're descending into depravity and permitting others to do said depravity. So that's kind of the setting the stage in chapter 1. So tonight we're going to be going over chapter 2, and Kufu and Serval have graciously volunteered to read through this so I don't throw my voice out. If you guys want to go ahead and do that, we're going to be reading through all of chapter 2, pretty short, and we're going to be talking about it a little bit. So Serval, I think you're up on the docket first.
Yep, 1 through 16?
Yes, thanks, buddy.
All right. You therefore have no excuse, you who pass judgment on someone else. For at whatever point you judge another, you are condemning yourself, because you who pass judgment do the same things. Now we know that God's judgment against those who do such things is based on truth. So when you, a mere human being, pass judgment on them and yet do the same things, do you think you will escape God's judgment? Or do you show contempt for the riches of his kindness, forbearance, and patience, not realizing that God's kindness is intended to lead you to repentance? But because of your stubbornness and your unrepentant heart, you are storing up wrath against yourself for the day of God's wrath, when his righteous judgment will be revealed. God will repay each person according to what they have done. To those who by persistence in doing good seek glory, honor, and immortality, he will give eternal life. But for those who are self-seeking and who reject the truth and follow evil, there will be wrath and anger. There will be trouble and distress for every human being who does evil, first for the Jew, then for the Gentile, but glory, honor, and peace for everyone who does good, first for the Jew, then for the Gentile. For God does not show favoritism. All who sin apart from the law will also perish apart from the law, and all who sin under the law will be judged by the law. For it is not those who hear the law who are righteous in God's sight, but it is those who obey the law who will be declared righteous. Indeed, when Gentiles who do not follow the law do by nature things required by the law, they are a law for themselves, even though they do not have the law. They show that the requirements of the law are written on their hearts, their conscience is also bearing witness, and their thoughts sometimes accusing them, and at other times even defending them. This will take place on the day when God judges people's secrets through Jesus Christ, as my gospel declares.
Now you, if you call yourself a Jew, if you rely on the law and boast in God, if you know his will and approve of what is superior because you are instructed by the law, if you are convinced that you are a guide for the blind, a light for those who are in the dark, an instructor of the foolish, a teacher of little children, because you have in the law the embodiment of knowledge and truth. You, then, who teach others, do you not teach yourself? You who preach against stealing, do you steal? Who say you who say that people should not commit adultery, do you commit adultery? You who abhor idols, do you rob temples? You who boast in the law, do you dishonor God by breaking the law? As it is written, God's name is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you. Circumcision has a value if you observe the law, but if you break the law, you have become as though you had not been circumcised. So then, if those who are not circumcised keep the law's requirements, will they not be regarded as though they were circumcised? The one who is not circumcised physically and yet obeys the law will condemn you who, even though you have the written code and circumcision, are a lawbreaker. A person is not a Jew who is one only outwardly, nor is circumcision merely outward and physical. No, a person is a Jew who is one inwardly, and circumcision is circumcision of the heart by the Spirit, not by the written code. Such a person's praise is not from other people, but from God.
Thank you guys very much for reading through that. I've thrown the link to the relevant chapter at hand into the text channel, so you can reference that as we're going throughout this. But yeah, so Paul's kind of continuing what he's been talking about. So we're going to do a little throwback to the end of chapter 1. So in this last section of chapter 1, what St. Paul is doing is he's listing out all of these abhorrent things that people are doing, murdering, lying, fraud, homosexuality, lust, abuse, just a whole litany of things. And he includes in that list, very interestingly, not just people that are committing those actions and living in sin, but right alongside it, people who approve of those things, right? So those who are kind of encouraging this activity. And it's a very eye-opening way to conclude the chapter. Paul lists all these horrific sins, and he highlights likewise those that cheer on these actions. So this kind of carries over directly into chapter 2. I mean, when he was writing this isn't a book with chapters. This is a letter. We've separated it into chapters and verses for convenience and reference sake. But this was written as a continuous thing, so it kind of makes sense that he's carrying through this into the start of chapter 2. But notice what he's doing here at the very beginning. Right after he concludes by saying those that applaud and permit these evil actions to happen, he begins chapter 2 with saying, "You have no excuse, therefore, who pass judgment on someone else. For at whatever point you judge another, you're condemning yourself, because you who pass judgment do the same things." He turns from addressing the morally bankrupt, and he starts addressing those who are generally morally upright according to the law. And he's specifically addressing the Judeans in Rome at the time. And I'm going to pull from a commentary that Thomas Aquinas did on Romans, and he says, after showing that the Gentiles did not become just from the knowledge of the truth they had, the apostle now shows that neither were the Jews made just by the things in which they gloried. Consequently, both of them need the power of the gospel's grace for salvation. St. Augustine also wrote about this topic. He said, Paul is speaking here of sins already committed. And when he says, "Oh man, whoever you are," he includes not only the Gentiles, but also the Jew who wanted to judge the Gentiles according to the law. And so Paul, when he says here, "For you who pass judgment do the same things," he's basically reiterating Christ's message in Matthew 7:5, where Christ says, "You hypocrite, first take the plank out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye." But importantly, he is highlighting the fact that those that are quick to pass condemnation were also guilty of all of these things. And thus they should be humble, because judgment does not come from internal moral conviction. He would later write on in his letter to the Corinthians, the first letter, chapter 6, verse 11, "And that is what some of you were," referencing a list of sins again that he gives. "But you were washed, you were sanctified, you were justified in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ and by the Spirit of God." So, as we judge the unrighteous, we point to a standard that is outside of ourselves. If we're properly judging the unrighteous, we're not pointing to us, right? We're not saying, "Oh, I'm better than this guy because I don't do this and he does, so screw him." We're not saying it's wrong to be homosexual because I am not. We're saying it because it's wrong according to God, right? We're measuring things up to the standard that God gives to us. And that standard happens to be better than all of us. And everyone, not just the people that are living obviously, are held accountable to the moral righteousness of God. And notice here that Paul isn't condemning the righteous for judging. He's not saying that inherently is wrong. He's giving them a warning. We are all guilty of the things that we are judging others for. And that's what he's highlighting in verse 3. So when you, a mere human being, pass judgment on them and yet do the same things, you think that you will escape God's judgment. On a surface level, this can look like, a condemnation of calling out sin, but we obviously know that that's not what he's talking about here. What he's condemning, what he's warning them about, he's giving them a warning. He's saying, just know that when you call other people out for this, you're going to be judged according to the same standard that you were calling out to. So just make sure that you're right, and just keep in mind that you should be calling these things out not for your own self-righteousness, not for your own, to get pumped up, but you should be, focusing inward and making sure that you're right with God. And in verse 5, continuing on this kind of theme, Paul warns the readers of this letter that being unrepentant and unchanging puts you on the path of destruction. Verse 5, because of your stubbornness and unrepentant heart, you are storing up wrath against yourself for the day of God's wrath, when his righteous judgment will be revealed. But this is not because God hates those that are, unrepentant or unchanging. Rather, it's a necessary consequence. Now, this is an idea that Paul is very clear about in all of his writings, right? That this wrath of God that he's telling people they're going to get, not just those that are living, obviously, but those that are maybe pretending to follow the law, pretending to be good Christians and secretly not. This wrath of God is not viewed in these scriptures as a punitive thing. It's more viewed as a necessary consequence. So we sort of touched on this when we talked about Adam and Eve a few weeks ago. I know I keep referencing these old studies, but really it all comes back to that, right? The origin of the aspects that we're discussing here, in that the death to Adam and to Eve was given to them not as a punishment, but a necessary consequence. St. John Chrysostom, who I referenced his commentary on Romans a lot last week, and I will continue to do so because it's insanely good. He writes about this concept. He says, when a man is neither softened by goodness or turned back by fear, what can be harder than he is? The true originator of wrath is one who has stored it up, not the one who judged, as Paul makes plain here. For he says, you are storing up wrath for yourself, not God is storing up wrath for you. And I think that this is a very important distinction to make when we think about sin and we think about disobeying God. It's not that God is sitting up there like rubbing his hands together, waiting. He's like, yeah, last judgment, this guy is about to get it. It's that people, by doing things that Paul is listing, by permitting these things to happen, they are storing it up for themselves. And I want to highlight here this concept of judgment that Paul is talking about, because he's talking about first us judging other people, but now he's talking about God judging people. And so we need to make a distinction here. And again, this is something we've touched on, but I'm going to go into a tiny bit more depth here. This concept of judgment that Paul's using, as well as it's given throughout the whole Old and New Testament, it's not, again, strictly punitive. It isn't just a punishment because of wrath. There's a lot of descriptive language used in scriptures to talk about God, and it's a good thing because it allows us to better conceptualize and relate to what's going on. However, it can trip us up because we start to fall into this sort of bad mindset that of humanizing God in a way, right? When it's really the opposite, right? He is not anthropomorphic. We are theomorphic. We're made after his image, not the other way around. Wrath, jealousy, anger, these are anthropomorphic concepts that we use to explain God in ways that we can understand and we can interface or relate to. That's all it is. We have to remember that God is not subject to emotions or passions like we are. We're corruptible creatures. We can get angry. We can get upset. Those things can affect us. That doesn't happen to God. He's not under the will of emotion, right? That's a human thing. And so we have to stop thinking about judgment necessarily in terms of like God is angry, and so he's pissed off, so he's gonna start dishing it out on people. It's more of a, like I said before, necessary consequence. When Paul or anyone speaks of judgment, it's far more helpful and accurate to think of judgment as setting in the correct order. It's not a response, it's how things should be, if that makes sense. So Paul would later write in 1 Corinthians 14:33, God is not a God of disorder, but of peace, as in all the congregations of the Lord's people. Right? So this order is something that is God, right? God is order. He is good. And so judgment is setting things back in that order where they should be. And viewing judgment in that lens kind of makes it a little more clear what Paul is describing here. And it also elucidates more what St. John Chrysostom is explaining about his words. And Paul starts to make this a little more clear in verses 6 through 10. What we do on this earth matters. Our choices to repent from sin, live as new creations like he talks about in 2 Corinthians 5:17. He gives 3 promises to the faithful: glory, honor, and peace. Whereas in the previous chapter, he lists out 3 woes for the unfaithful. And notice here, he's making this distinction again between Jew and Greek, or Jew and Gentile. What he's really talking about is people that follow the law of Moses and people that don't. And he's saying that that it's going to be applicable to all people, as he highlighted in the previous chapter. St. John Chrysostom says, which Jews and Greeks is Paul talking about here? Those before Christ's coming, of course. For he has not yet gotten to the time of grace in the development of his argument, but is still dwelling on earlier times. For if there was no difference before, how can there be any now? This is why he puts so much emphasis on this point. When referring here to Greeks, Paul does not mean those who worshipped idols, but those who adored God, who obeyed the laws of nature, who kept all the commandments without fail apart from the Jewish observances, which contribute towards godliness. Melchizedek was one of those people, and so were Job, the Ninevites, Cornelius. It is on works that punishment and reward depend, not on circumcision and uncircumcision. So John Chrysostom is highlighting here that it's not about which, ethno-religious group you belong to. It's about, are you following God or not? Paul has already said that the Gentile will not go unpunished. And on this basis, he said also that the Gentile would be rewarded. Now he shows the law and circumcision are superfluous. For in this passage, it is the Jews that he is mainly opposing. And this idea is carried further in verse 12 through 15, where Paul addresses the fact that knowledge of God's law isn't what makes one righteous. It's upholding the law. And he also reiterates one of the themes from the first chapter, that the law of God is written on all of our hearts, such that we know good, evil, we know God, we know how to follow God, etc. And he further goes on to address the fact that those who did not have the original Mosaic law are still able to be condemned at the last days. Their conscience, the law written on their hearts that he talks about in chapter 1, that's enough to condemn them. It's also enough to live righteously. And so this argument is being formed here that we can't escape our responsibility through declaring ignorance. And in addition to this, he writes in verse 15, their thoughts sometimes accuse them and at other times defend them. In theory, it might be supposed that we could be justified through following of our moral conscience, kind of reiterating what John Chrysostom was writing about a second ago. But just like the Israelites were unable to uphold the Torah perfectly, all are unable to answer their own conscience correctly. We all sin and we all fall short of God's glory, as Paul will go on to iterate later on in this book. And I can imagine all of us in here have had times where our conscience has told us to do one thing and we do the other, where we treat people poorly, where we do bad decisions for ourselves, even though we know what the right thing to do is. And that's what Paul is discussing here. And he kind of pivots at this point to start specifically addressing the Judeans now. Now he's going to start talking about, this is in verse 17, this is why the chapter is sectioned off here. He's going to start addressing them and the hypocrisy that they're having, right, in the face of all that he has argued thus far. You'll see this a lot in Paul's writing. He's a very rhetorically skilled person, and he constructs a lot of the things that he says as a form of call and response arguments. So he'll first make claims and back those up, and then he'll demonstrate how who he's talking to is not meeting those claims, if that makes sense. He's addressing the Judeans now in what they do, what they say, and think about this in the context of like what's going on here. You have people that are the Judaizers again. They're basically saying that you can't be holy, you can't be a Christian unless you follow the Mosaic law. And Paul is telling them, no, that's not how it goes. And he chastises them for being arrogant and self-centered when it comes to following God. He points out their hypocrisy in failing to uphold the law while at the same time boasting that they are better than the rest of their world because they have access to the law. In verse 17, now you, if you call yourself a Judean, if you rely on the law and boast in God, if you know his will and approve of what is superior because you are instructed by the law, if you are convinced that you are a guide for the blind, a light for those who are in the dark, an instructor to the foolish, a teacher of children, because you have in the law the embodiment of knowledge and the truth, you then who teach others, do you not teach yourself? You who preach against stealing, do you steal? You who say that people should not commit adultery, do you commit adultery? You abhor idols, but do you rob temples? You who boast in the law, do you dishonor God by breaking the law? It's a very kind of scathing remark against these people and the arrogance that they're having. And that's what he's addressing, is this arrogance. St. John Chrysostom writes about this. He says, the Jew may boast that he is loved by God and honored above all other men. It seems to me that here Paul is gently mocking their unreasonableness because they misused this gift to set themselves up against the rest of mankind and to despise them. Now, we can, we could talk all day about how that's translated into the behavior of modern day adherents to Judaism, right? Which, of course, during our Talmud study, we talked about that's not really the same thing as what is being discussed here in the New Testament. But it's very serious what Paul is bringing to them. In verse 24, he hits them with something very, very intense. He pulls from Isaiah 52:5 here, and he says that God's name is blasphemed because of them. Because they dishonor the law, they dishonor God, and they lead others astray through their actions. It's not just that they're doing wrong, they're causing others to do wrong. Keep in mind that last verse of chapter 1, those that permit and applaud these actions, these sins, right? Talking about that again. And although St. Paul is addressing the Judeans specifically here and what they do and what they say, think about this from the context that we are in Christianity. As in, we are the new sons of Abraham. We are the bearers of the Holy Spirit, right? What he's talking about here, about as Chrysostom writes, setting yourself up against the rest of mankind and despising them, that's a trap that a lot of Christians get wrapped up in, using Christianity as the moral high ground in a condescending way. I've done this before. I've been very guilty of this before. I'm sure all of you have at some point been guilty of this before. It's specifically a problem against that I've seen a lot in people that are kind of in this kind of sphere of thinking, right? Setting yourselves apart from the world, but doing so not in a way to glorify God or to purify yourself, but to pass condemnation on others to make yourself look better. All right, using religion as a high horse. I'm better than you. And it would be wise to remember this accusation that St. Paul is giving. The name of God is blasphemed because of you. And we should ask ourselves, do we, in our zeal, repel others from Christ? Do we act arrogantly because we know the truth and others don't? Remember, and it's hard to remember this because it's in a collapsing world of decadence and degeneracy, it's really easy to accept the fact that, yes, we're better than other people, but we have to remember that we have no right to take pride in salvation because it wasn't accomplished by us. It was a gift from God. Now, That's not to say you shouldn't be happy when you do the right things. That's not to say that you shouldn't take some level of pride in your own tenacity. But remember, all of this points back to God, right? And that's what Paul is highlighting here, that that it goes back to God, right? It's not our knowledge of the truth that makes us better. It's making us better is what we should be actively seeking to be, not something that we use as a point of pride. To quote somebody that I value a lot, it's not good to plateau. It's not good to say, I'm in a good place now, I don't have to get better, I can just look down at the people that are down below me, right? No, you've got to keep pushing and striving upwards, keep doing the moral things, keep following the moral law of God, and that's what Paul is making very clear here. And he goes on to hammer with the rest of this chapter that point exactly. And in this last section, he talks about circumcision, which of course we know is an outward sign of faithfulness to God that is worthless without a spiritual change, without a change of being. It matters more what the contents of our heart are. In verse 27, Paul writes, "The one who is not circumcised physically and yet obeys the law will condemn you, who, even though you have the written code and circumcision, are a lawbreaker." And again, Paul is attacking the Judaizers who do performative acts as a display but have rotten content of heart. But he's also addressing any of those who believe that outward cries of faith are the most important thing while having nothing true or genuine inside. And this is reflecting the reality of Christ's lambastment of the Pharisees. When we were going through the book of John, he does this a lot, where he condemns them for putting on this big show but having nothing of worth inside of it. It reflects the necessity of a contrite heart, humble before God, over everything else, as David writes in Psalm 50. It echoes what Christ says in Matthew 5:23 during the Sermon on the Mount, where he says, "Therefore, if you are offering your gift at the altar, and there remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift there in front of the altar. First go and be reconciled to them, then come and offer your gift." And this is kind of what Paul's message to these Judaizers is that okay, you think you're better because you have this physical sign of faithfulness to God, but your works don't show it. Who you are doesn't show that faithfulness. What you do doesn't show that faithfulness. And even though this is, again, specifically to these groups of people, this is something that we can pull from. Is it better to develop yourself faithfully, right? Or is it better to boast about how you're a Christian? I'm a Christian, I'm traditional, I have the right opinions, blah, blah, blah. But who you are as a person, does that show it? Could people tell that from talking to you? Or would it be a surprise when you said, I'm a Christian to somebody? What Paul's been driving home this entire chapter is that our inward character is what counts to God. Following the law as it is written on our hearts, recognizing that without the saving grace of Christ, we are nothing. We are not to be boastful in how good we are or in the good things we do, and especially not the good things that we know. It's cool to get involved in theology, read the church fathers, know what you believe. Look, I mean that's why I'm running a Bible study, right? There is value in understanding these things, studying Christian philosophy, knowing the history of whatever church you're in, understanding really at the core of like the doctrines and where they come from, and why does the priest wear this type of garment? It's in this verse in Numbers. Or, why do we baptize people? It's right here at the end of Matthew, right? But you're not going to be saved by arguing over Catholic dogmatics or what one verse means from the other with random people on the internet. Instead, what St. Paul's call here, that rhymes, unfortunately, but what his call here is to strive every day to be better through the grace of Christ, to take what we know and to apply it, to inwardly reflect what we are outwardly doing, to become new creations such that people don't have to ask if we're Christians. They know that we're Christians by what we do, what we say, who we are. Else we stand before the throne of God at the last of days and have nothing to show for all the things we know and do, lest we're not able to receive entrance into the kingdom because we are dishonest with ourselves and others about who we are and what the gospel is and what that means in terms of how it's supposed to change us, how it's supposed to alter the core of our beings into new creations again, like Paul writes in Corinthians. And that's the kind of underlying themes here in chapter 2. Setting up that people, even though you may do a bunch of good stuff, it doesn't matter if your heart's in the wrong place. You know, it's good things, sure. Just like I guess on some level it's good to be circumcised in the old covenant. Now, of course, it's not a thing, but it doesn't really matter if it's not in the heart. It doesn't really matter if it's not a reflection of a change inward. And so as, we go throughout our weeks and we meditate on this, I hope you all think about these things that we read. But as you do, kind of think about that. Think about the ways that you are drawing people to Christ, the ways that you are repelling people to Christ in your actions, right? Think about the arrogance that's so easy to have and so sweet, to be better than somebody else. Think about that and try to focus and remember that that's not you. You are better because of God. And, he's the one that strengthens you to be like that. And to not only do better things, but to be a new being through Christ.